房价暴跌比房价暴涨给中国经济带来的摧毁更大，老百姓的财富70%都在房产。
中国这4家银行倒闭了，喜欢往银行存钱的朋友切记要留个心眼。随着硅谷银行的倒闭，打碎了。
Recently, a knitwear factory in Xi'an announced on November 1st that due to severe inventory backlogs, the factory has decided to give all workers an early holiday this year. Some workers started their holiday from November 3rd, while others will leave after finishing remaining yarn orders. The tentative date to resume work is set for February 27, 2024. Other examples include a steel factory in Xi'an that announced a full production shutdown and employee holiday from November 1st until February 17th next year. Videos online show workers in Xi'an saying factory jobs are very difficult to find now, with many factories having no business and starting holidays. Some factories are still paying basic living expenses and social insurance for workers during the prolonged holidays, showing they are struggling to survive. But many other factories have shut down completely, leaving workers with no compensation or even unpaid wages. The extended holidays reflect China's ongoing economic downturn, with order losses and oversupply in many industries. Official customs data on November 7th showed October exports dropped 6.4% year-on-year, indicating weak external demand. This shows that the Chinese economy continues to decline. Not only that, the real estate bubble has burst, sparking contagion into the banking sector. At the same time, extreme weather has precipitated an energy crisis, agricultural failures, and rising food costs. With debt at unprecedented levels across households, companies, and governments, authorities have limited ammunition to restore robust growth. After decades of breakneck expansion, the world's second-largest economy may be heading for a sharp and protracted slowdown. If mismanaged, these compounding pressures could ignite public discontent that challenges the social contract between the Chinese Communist Party and its citizens. The real estate crisis. China's once booming real estate sector is now facing a severe crisis, with property developers defaulting on debts, unfinished housing projects, and declining home sales. This ongoing crisis in the real estate industry, which makes up an estimated 30% of China's GDP.
房价暴跌比房价暴涨给中国经济带来的摧毁更大，老百姓的财富70%都在房产，所以如果真的房价暴跌，中国老百姓70%的财富将灰飞烟灭，对吗？我现在投房产还有机会吗？你们这一代人成为车奴、房奴、孩奴。我们努力了20年，我们努力了30年，等你的孩子长大那一天，他还需要成为房奴、车奴、孩奴吗？爸爸一套，妈妈一套，爷爷一套，奶奶一套，5套房。各位，中国现在修的房子、已经在建的房子和人们住的房子。
The current problems plaguing China's real estate sector stem largely from government policies intended to rein in excessive borrowing and speculation. Stricter limits on leverage ratios for developers, along with curbs on homebuyers' mortgage access, have led to a liquidity crunch and plummeting demand. Major developers like Evergrande and Country Garden have already defaulted on offshore bond payments. The scale of China's real estate troubles is immense. Offshore defaults by Chinese property firms surged to a record $54 billion in 2022, and the defaults are accelerating. The rate tripled in just 1 year. This crisis of confidence has meant new housing projects aren't being completed, pre-sales aren't materializing, and buyers aren't trusting developers to finish projects. The banking crisis. The real estate crisis has now bled into the banking sector. Smaller regional banks that lent heavily to developers are at risk as loans default. In July, depositors at several rural banks in Henan province were unable to make withdrawals, sparking protests. 4 banks froze deposits from hundreds of thousands of customers.
中国这4家银行倒闭了，喜欢往银行存钱的朋友切记要留个心眼。随着硅谷银行的倒闭，打碎了很多人对银行的看法。很多人以为银行是最靠谱的，未免太天真。 虽然银行背后有着非常强大的信誉来做支撑，但是银行作为
There are grave concerns about contagion effects at the thousands of small regional lenders in China. These smaller banks hold around 25% of banking assets, but are far weaker than the large state-owned commercial banks. If panicked depositors start withdrawing en masse, it could quickly spiral into a full-blown banking crisis. The big four state banks are also vulnerable. They hold significant exposure to real estate, an estimated 40% of outstanding loans. As developers default, these loans turn sour, putting the big banks under pressure. Their price-to-earnings ratios have fallen to all-time lows this year. The Bank of China has begun limiting customer withdrawals, further fueling unease. The credit crisis? On top of real estate and banking distress, access to credit is tightening in China. In response to years of unrestrained leverage, authorities have been trying to rein in reckless lending. Debt to GDP rose from 158% in 2008 to over 270% in 2020. But reducing credit too hastily comes with consequences. The central bank cut key interest rates in August 2022 to stimulate borrowing as economic growth falters. SME that account for over 60% of GDP are facing an acute credit crunch. Many are turning back to loosely regulated shadow banks. The local governments are also highly leveraged after years of borrowing for infrastructure spending. With land sales revenue falling, they face a squeeze just as Beijing pressures them to stabilize the property sector. Local government financing vehicles have defaulted on some bonds and faced $900 billion in debt due by end 2023.
就在今天11月1号，失信潮竟然提前来了。全国被失信人数已经突破了800万，你觉得这是一件小事吗？还是说失信就失信了呗？你可能不知道这意味着什么，不单是负债人多了，而是整个社会体系的征信系统有巨大问题，原有的征信系统成为了天大的笑话。这要从2019年说起。
Food security crisis. China is facing a severe food security crisis driven by extreme heat waves, drought, and flooding this past year. These climate shocks have decimated agricultural yields across the country. Rice production fell 2.1% in 2022, while corn production declined by 1%. Major flooding along the Yangtze River also destroyed farms and disrupted transport routes critical for food distribution. The impact is so dire that China is now planning to ration grains, edible oils, and electricity for aluminum smelting to direct limited supplies towards households. With global food prices spiking due to the Ukraine war, China's crop failures spell disaster. Domestic cereal prices jumped over 10% in 2022, the highest rate in over a decade. The agricultural losses mean China will need to massively increase imports to feed its population, placing further strain on food inflation and the economy. Grain imports tripled in 2021 and will rise even higher in 2022 based on USDA estimates. However, purchasing grains competitively on global markets may prove enormously expensive given tight supplies worldwide following poor harvests in Europe and North America. Wheat imports are expected to rise over 60% to 10 million tons as domestic wheat production dropped 3% this year. Corn imports are forecast to hit 30 million tons, the third highest on record. Rising import costs will drive up food prices, inflicting hardship on the average Chinese household. Food accounts for over 30% of CPI. Higher costs will leave less disposable income to support consumer spending. Increasing food insecurity will test the social contract between the CCP and Chinese citizens. Ensuring affordable food and energy has been a cornerstone of stability. With the country already facing economic headwinds, substantially higher living costs due to food inflation will undoubtedly aggravate public discontent. Energy crisis. Searing drought has also sparked an energy crisis in China as hydropower output has collapsed. In July 2022, power generation from dams fell 25% compared to 2021. Sichuan province saw industrial power use drop by 73% in August as factories were shut down on government orders. In total, 21 provinces saw strict energy controls and forced limiting of electricity usage for industrial facilities. Thermal power plants cannot offset the loss in hydropower since coal supplies are also hindered by drought conditions at major mining regions. Coal output fell 10% in October across key producing areas. Coal imports have increased but remain insufficient, leading to widespread energy rationing. In September, China imported 32.88 million tons of coal, up 13% from the prior year, but the increase is nowhere near enough to make up for collapsing domestic coal output. The power crunch has shuttered factories across the manufacturing sector, disrupting supply chains. Even households face blackouts of up to 6 to 7 hours per day, as provincial power grids struggle to match demand. Industrial output has taken a considerable hit. Aluminum production fell over 40% in August and September versus last year. Other metals like zinc, lead, and steel have also seen sharp declines, with mills closing on government orders. As a result of the power shortage, over 70% of stainless steel producers were shuttered in Jiangsu province in Sept 2022. Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Guangdong, and Shanghai are some of the worst impacted manufacturing hubs. The economic damage is substantial. The power crisis has delayed production and orders across export-focused sectors like textiles, toys, and electronics. This is throttling an already vulnerable economy. Fallout for the economy. Most experts agree that a severe economic slowdown is underway given concurrent headwinds. GDP growth in Q4 2022 is expected to be just 2.5% or lower. For context, China averaged 9% GDP growth from 1990 to 2020. Growth below 3% would be remarkably tepid. If the real estate sector meaningfully unwinds, the economy will slow drastically. Tens of millions stand to lose jobs in related industries like construction, steel, and manufacturing. As cash flow dries up, developers will cut investment, which accounts for 25% of GDP. This real estate impact alone could shave 2 percentage points or more off GDP growth. If compounded by financial contagion from bank failures, the downturn could turn into a multi-year lost decade like Japan in the 1990s. Some economists see GDP falling as low as 2% if widespread bank runs take hold. A full-blown banking crisis would also freeze lending and crush private investment. The last time China GDP grew less than 3% was 1976 during the death of Mao Zedong. The CCP has tools to manage the downturn, including slashing interest rates, easing credit controls, and ramping fiscal stimulus. But these tools may lose effectiveness given how heavily stretched the economy is after years of excess leverage. Securitization of bad loans can shift risk away from banks, but ultimately the debt still sits on government balance sheets. If handled improperly, NPL could remain an albatross around China's neck for years.